The cafe was alive with the usual morning buzz, the hum of conversation blending with the hiss of the espresso machine and the gentle clinking of cups and saucers. It was the kind of place where people came not only for their caffeine fix, but for a slice of community. Students studying at the corner tables, business people preparing for meetings, retirees swapping stories over pastries. The scent of fresh-baked bread lingered in the air, mingling with the aroma of strong coffee beans, creating a warmth that seemed to soften the edges of the bustling morning. Into this environment walked Marcus, a tall young black man with an air of quiet determination and thoughtfulness about him. He carried a stack of books tucked under one arm and a well-worn laptop bag over his shoulder. He wasn't dressed in a suit, nor did he try to stand out, but his presence carried a certain gravity. His calm demeanor and thoughtful eyes suggested he was someone who carried the weight of knowledge and experience wherever he went. Today, he wasn't here to give one of his talks or to mentor young leaders like he often did. Today, he simply wanted a cup of coffee, a corner seat, and maybe a few hours of peace to work on the new lecture he had been preparing. The line wasn't too long, though the cafe was crowded. Marcus found himself standing behind an elderly man reading the newspaper and a woman who seemed hurried, her arms filled with shopping bags. He balanced his books carefully and shifted his bag onto his other shoulder, scanning the cafe for an open table he could claim once he ordered. He spotted one near the window, bathed in soft light, and made a mental note to hurry once he got his drink. The chatter around him was a comfortable white noise until something pierced through it, a voice sharp and cold. The woman in front, Sovhim, the one juggling shopping bags, turned suddenly, her expression twisted with disdain. Her eyes raked over Marcus with a look that could only be described as dripping with prejudice. Without hesitation, and with no provocation, she spat out words so venomous they seemed to suck the air out of the entire room. "Why don't you just go back to Africa?" The words seemed to hang in the air like a toxin, poisoning the atmosphere. The cafe fell silent almost instantly. Cups were lowered to saucers, conversations stopped mid-sentence, and even the barista froze in place, unsure of whether to keep making drinks. Some people gasped audibly, their hands covering their mouths, in shock. Others looked down, suddenly fascinated by their phones or the floor, unwilling to make eye contact, as though ignoring it would erase what had just happened. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering to one another, glancing at Marcus, then at the woman, unsure of what was about to unfold. Marcus himself didn't move at first. He stood there, books in hand, staring at the woman who had just unleashed her cruelty without warning. His posture didn't sag under the weight of her words, nor did his expression twist into anger. Instead, there was a pause, a deep stillness, as though he were allowing the weight of her insult to reveal itself fully before deciding how to handle it. It wasn't the first time Marcus had encountered such hatred. He was no stranger to prejudice, and he knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control if he reacted in kind. Still, the sting of the words was undeniable. There was always a bite to them, no matter how strong you thought you were, because they weren't just words. They were centuries of history, ignorance, and pain condensed into one cruel command. The woman didn't stop there. She smirked, clearly emboldened by the silence of the crowd. Her voice grew louder, as though she wanted the whole cafe to hear her cruelty. "That's right, you heard me. People like you don't belong here, always taking up space, always acting like you own the place. Why don't you just go back to where you came from? This isn't your country." Her words crackled through the cafe like electricity, sending another ripple of shock through the crowd. A mother sitting with her young daughter quickly covered the girl's ears while a group of college students exchanged uneasy glances, one of them muttering under their breath about how unbelievable this was. But nobody stepped in. Not yet. Marcus adjusted his grip on his books, his fingers tightening around the worn covers. He could feel the eyes of every person in the room on him, waiting, watching. Some expected him to lash out, to raise his voice, to meet hate with hate. Others expected him to shrink, to quietly endure the abuse and slink away, as so many people had been forced to do in similar situations. But Marcus had never been one to fit into people's expectations. He knew that his response now would not just be for himself, but for everyone watching. For the young girl whose mother had shielded her, for the students who looked lost, for the older man who shook his head in shame but said nothing. Inside, Marcus's mind, memories stirred. He thought of his grandmother, who had lived through segregation and who had always told him, "Baby, your dignity is your armor. Don't let nobody strip you of it." He thought of his father, who had worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table, teaching Marcus the value of hard work and pride in who he was. He thought of all the moments in his own life where he had faced subtle slights and blatant bigotry, each one a test of his patience, his strength, and his will. This moment, here in this cafe, felt like all of those moments rolled into one, magnified by the silence of the crowd. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. Instead of retreating or reacting in anger, Marcus stepped forward. He placed his books down gently on the nearest table, as though making space not just physically but mentally to address what had just happened. His movements were deliberate, calm, and controlled, drawing the eyes of every single person in the cafe. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his glasses, and turned to face the woman fully. His presence seemed to grow larger in that instant. Not because of aggression, but because of the unshakable calm that radiated from him. The woman faltered slightly under his gaze. Her smirk wavered, though she quickly tried to reassemble it. She hadn't expected him to respond this way. She had wanted him to crumble, to shout, or to walk away. What she hadn't anticipated was his silence, his composure, his quiet defiance. The crowd held its breath, the anticipation thick enough to feel. Everyone wondered, what would he say? What words could possibly answer such raw hatred? Even the barista, who had been frozen mid-order, leaned forward over the counter, her eyes fixed on Marcus. A man sitting by the door put down his phone, forgetting the email he had been typing. A couple in the corner leaned closer to each other, whispering about whether they should intervene or just let the man handle it. The room was suspended in a strange kind of limbo, a collective moment where time itself seemed to slow, waiting for Marcus to speak, and Marcus, standing tall in the center of it all, knew that whatever he said next would not just be his response to her. It would be a message, intentional or not, to everyone in that cafe. A lesson, a truth, a mirror held up to the ugliness that had just been exposed. He wasn't sure exactly how he would frame it yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He would not let her words define him. He would not let hate go unchallenged, and he would not give the crowd a spectacle of anger when what the world desperately needed was dignity, wisdom, and courage. He opened his mouth slightly, then paused, choosing his words carefully. The cafe waited, hearts pounding, breaths caught, in throats. The silence was louder than any noise could have been. Marcus was about to turn this moment, this cruel, humiliating, hateful moment, into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. Marcus looked at her, then at the room, and something in the air shifted. It was the way he moved, the deliberate calm in every gesture, the steady tone of a man who had long ago learned that strength wasn't always loud. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. He placed his hand gently on the table beside him, steadying himself, and when he spoke, his words rolled out with a weight that seemed to echo off the walls. "You want me to go back to Africa?" he said slowly, his voice carrying across the cafe so that no one had to strain to hear. The room leaned in, every ear hungry for what would come next. "Let's talk about that for a moment." The woman's smirk twitched again, but she didn't interrupt. Maybe it was the confidence in his tone, maybe the sudden realization that he wasn't going to crumble. A few people in the crowd exchanged glances, some nodding faintly, others whispering under their breath. A college student near the back pulled out her phone, not to scroll this time, but to record. Marcus continued, "Africa is not what you think it is. People throw the word around like it's an insult, like it's a place to shame someone into feeling small. But Africa is the root of civilization. It's the birthplace of humanity itself. Science tells us that the first humans walked the soil of Africa. That means without Africa, none of us, black, white, or otherwise, would be here." His voice was calm, but with each sentence, his words grew heavier, carrying centuries of truth with them. The cafe was silent, but it was no longer the silence of discomfort. It was the silence of being pulled in, the kind of silence that comes when people know they're hearing something important. Marcus's gaze swept the room, making eye contact with people who quickly looked away, embarrassed at their earlier inaction. He didn't linger on their shame. His words weren't just for the woman. They were for everyone present. "You tell me to go back," Marcus went on, "as if I don't already know the weight of that history. My ancestors didn't come here by choice. They were stolen, chained, and shipped across oceans into slavery. They were forced to build the foundations of this very country, its farms, its roads, its wealth, while enduring the whip, the shackle, and the auction block. They never saw Africa again, because people who looked like you decided they never would." The woman flinched at the bluntness of his words, though she tried to mask it with a scoff. Her eyes darted around the room, as if looking for someone to back her up, but no one came. The crowd wasn't with her anymore. They were with him. Marcus leaned slightly forward, his tone unwavering. "So when you tell me to go back, what exactly do you mean? Do you mean back to a land my ancestors were ripped away from, never to return? Do you mean back to a continent rich in culture, art, and science? Things you probably don't even know existed there long before Europe had its Renaissance? Or do you mean back because you think this country doesn't belong to me?" He paused deliberately, letting the weight of the question settle. "Because if that's what you mean, let's be honest. This land didn't belong to your ancestors, either. It belonged to the native people, people who were massacred, displaced, and erased so that your family could live here. So let me ask you, where should you go back to?" There was a collective intake of breath from the crowd, the kind that happens when someone says the thing everyone was too afraid to say. A man in a suit sitting near the window actually muttered, "Damn," under his breath, unable to contain his shock and admiration. The students recording exchanged wide-eyed glances, realizing they were witnessing something much larger than a cafe argument. The woman's face turned red, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. Her arrogance was slipping, unraveling in front of everyone. She opened her mouth again, then closed it, caught between her pride and the undeniable truth pressing down on her. Marcus didn't let her off the hook. His tone softened slightly, but the firmness remained. "I'm not here to fight with you. I don't need to shout to prove a point. I'm here to remind you, and everyone in this room, that my presence here is not some accident or intrusion. My ancestors paid for this soil with their blood, their sweat, their tears, and after centuries of being told to leave, to step aside, to stay silent, we're still here. Not only are we here, we're thriving. We're doctors, teachers, engineers, leaders, artists. We've built businesses, we've led movements, we've defended this country in wars that weren't always willing to defend us in return. And yet, we continue to give, to serve, to build." He stopped for a moment, letting his words ripple through the room. People shifted uncomfortably, not because they disagreed, but because truth has a way of stirring the soul, forcing you to face things you'd rather not confront. Marcus's eyes locked back on the woman. "You tell me to go back to Africa, but maybe you should open a history book first. Maybe you should learn that Africa is not a punchline, not an insult, not a place to exile people. It's a cradle of kings and queens, of mathematicians and astronomers, of builders and dreamers. And maybe you should learn that America, this place you claim is yours, was built by the very people you're trying to push out. A murmur of agreement ran through the cafe. A man near the counter nodded slowly, while the mother with her daughter whispered softly, "He's right, baby." Listen to him. The college students recording whispered, "Wow," almost in unison, realizing they were capturing something powerful, something that would be shared far beyond these four walls. The woman shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her defiance shrinking under the pressure of Marcus's truth. Her arms, once crossed in arrogance, now hung awkwardly at her sides. She opened her mouth again, but no words came, just a faint, frustrated hiss of breath. Marcus didn't smile, didn't gloat. He wasn't here to humiliate her. He was here to teach, to stand in his truth, to make it clear that her words had no power over him. "So no," he said firmly, "I will not go back to Africa, because I belong here. Just as much as you. Maybe even more because I know the cost of what it took for me to stand here today. And the question isn't whether I belong. The question is whether you can handle the truth of that belonging." The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence from earlier. It was a silence of awe, of recognition, of respect. It was the kind of silence that happens when people realize they've just witnessed something unforgettable. The woman's face burned crimson. She clutched her shopping bags tighter, her eyes darting around for an ally, but there were none. The crowd wasn't on her side anymore. She looked small, diminished, stripped of the power she thought her insult would give her. And for the first time since she'd spoken, she had nothing left to say. Marcus let the silence stretch, not to shame her, but to give weight to the lesson. He wanted it to sink in, not just for her, but for everyone who had watched silently, who had thought staying quiet was safer. He wanted them to leave this cafe not just with their lattes and croissants, but with the memory of this moment, the reminder that hate doesn't have the final word. The college student filming whispered to her friend, "People need to see this," and her friend nodded, eyes wide. The older man with the newspaper lowered it, shaking his head slowly, murmuring, "About time someone said it out loud." Marcus remained still, his calm presence filling the space. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't cursed. He hadn't let anger define the moment. Instead, he had turned her insult into a history lesson, into a mirror, into a truth that couldn't be denied. And now, the ball was no longer in her court. It was in the hearts of every person who had been there to witness it. And though she didn't realize it, her attempt to humiliate him had only elevated him. She had meant to silence him, but she had given him the floor. She had meant to shame him, but she had revealed her own ignorance instead. She had meant to belittle him, but in the end, he had stood taller than ever. Marcus stood there, his books resting neatly on the table, the faint steam of coffee cups rising around him, and the weight of every eye in the cafe locked on him. The woman's insult had already crumbled under the sheer force of his truth, but Marcus wasn't finished. His voice, steady and deliberate, carried with it the quiet authority of someone who had walked through fire and chosen to come out whole. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly, but with a resonance that reached every corner of the room. "This land, this country, is as much mine as it is yours. My ancestors didn't build it for me to be told to leave. They built it because they had no choice. And in building it, they gave me a rightful place here." He let that sink in. The silence in the cafe was thick, the kind that felt almost sacred, like the pause before the final note of a song. He didn't look angry, though he had every right to be. He didn't look bitter, though the sting of her words could have easily cut him that way. Instead, he looked resolute, calm, and dignified. The kind of calm that could only come from knowing your worth, even when others tried to strip it from you. Marcus's eyes swept the crowd, not just the woman who had insulted him. He looked at the mother who had shielded her daughter's ears, the students still clutching their phones, the the barista frozen behind the counter with her hands trembling slightly. "We're not going anywhere," he continued, "because we've always been here. My people have endured slavery, segregation, and systemic discrimination. We've been denied housing, denied education, denied the right to vote. We've been told in 1,000 ways to go back or to stay quiet. But despite every obstacle, every insult, every system designed to hold us down, we rose. We kept building, kept creating, kept moving forward. And we're still here, still thriving." He paused and softened his voice even more, speaking almost like he was addressing not just them, but generations yet to come. "You see, when someone tells me to go back, they're really saying they can't handle the truth of my presence. They can't handle the fact that I stand as living proof of resilience, of survival, of strength they can't take credit for. They can't handle that their hate cannot erase me, and that's what scares them most, that no matter how loud they shout, I remain." A man at a nearby table, who had been silent up until now, murmured a quiet "Amen" under his breath. It wasn't religious. It was recognition. It was respect. Marcus's gaze returned to the woman, whose cheeks were flushed crimson. Her arrogance had long since melted away, replaced by a raw, uneasy shame. She clutched her shopping bags like a lifeline, her lips pressed tightly together. She couldn't meet his eyes anymore. She looked small, diminished, like a shadow of the person who had moments earlier barked her insult with such misplaced pride. But Marcus didn't sneer. He didn't revel in her discomfort. He hadn't set out to destroy her. He had set out to reveal something greater. He wanted her, and everyone here, to leave with a truth they couldn't forget. "I belong here," Marcus said clearly, "and nothing you say can change that. This cafe, this city, this country, my bloodline is woven into it all. And whether you accept it or not, I will not move aside, and I will not go back. Because this is my home." The words struck like thunder, yet he'd spoken them with the gentleness of rain. It was that balance, the fire of truth wrapped in the calm of dignity, that left the crowd speechless. And then, slowly, it began. A single clap, hesitant but heartfelt, from the back of the room. Then another, and another. Until suddenly the cafe erupted into applause, the kind that wasn't just about approval. It was about relief, about gratitude, about being witness to something deeply human. People stood, some with tears in their eyes, others with smiles of awe, clapping not just for Marcus, but for the truth he had spoken into existence. The woman's face crumpled. She grabbed her purse, tightened her grip on her bags, and stormed toward the door, her footsteps sharp against the tiled floor. But even in her exit, she couldn't drown out the sound of the clapping, the voices that now belonged to Marcus, not her. She pushed the door open, the bell above it jangling, and disappeared into the street outside, swallowed by the world that no longer applauded her ignorance. Marcus didn't follow her with his eyes. He simply smiled faintly, adjusted his glasses, and sat down at the table where his books waited. The crowd kept clapping until he gently raised a hand, as though to say, "That's enough." They quieted, though the energy in the room lingered, a buzz of something they hadn't expected when they came in for their morning coffee. The barista finally moved, her voice breaking the silence. "Sir, that was incredible." She looked down at her hands, realizing she'd been trembling the whole time. Marcus gave her a small, reassuring nod. "Sometimes," he said, "you don't need to shout to be heard." A student approached, her phone still recording, her voice shaking. "People need to see this. They need to hear it. Can I share this?" Marcus glanced at her, then at the phone, and then smiled. If it helps someone remember they belong to, then yes. Share it. The mother with her daughter leaned over, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saying what so many of us wish we could say." Her daughter peeked up at Marcus, wide-eyed, as though she had just seen a superhero in real life. Marcus bent slightly, just enough so his words would reach her small ears. "Don't ever let anyone tell you that you don't belong," he said, gently. "You're as much a part of this world as anyone else." The little girl smiled shyly, her small hand clutching her mother's tighter. Marcus leaned back in his chair, finally reaching for the coffee he had ordered, now cooling slightly, on the table. He took a sip, savoring it as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. To him, this wasn't about fame or spectacle. It wasn't about being remembered. It was about standing in his truth, refusing to let hate dictate the narrative. But to everyone else in that cafe, it was unforgettable. They had walked in that morning expecting lattes, croissants, and casual conversation. Instead, they had been witnesses to a moment of history, a lesson in grace, courage, and dignity. They had watched a man take the ugliest of insults and turn it into a masterpiece of truth. As people filed out later that morning, their conversations were no longer about work deadlines or weekend plans. They spoke about Marcus. They repeated his words. They carried them like seeds, ready to be planted in other rooms, other conversations, other hearts. And for those who had recorded it, the video would ripple far beyond this cafe, reaching thousands, maybe millions, who would hear his response and feel the same mixture of awe and conviction. The woman's words would be forgotten. Marcus's words would not. By the time the cafe returned to its normal rhythm, the clink of cups, the hiss of milk steaming, the hum of conversation, the atmosphere had changed. Something had shifted. People glanced at Marcus with quiet respect, some offering nods, others simply carrying the weight of what they had witnessed in their own way. Marcus didn't seek their admiration. He didn't need it. He opened one of his books, pulled out his laptop, and began to type, as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. And maybe that was the most extraordinary part of it, that he didn't need to rage or to boast. He didn't need to celebrate his victory. He simply lived in his truth, because to him, it wasn't a performance. It was survival. It was history. It was dignity. The world outside moved on, cars honking, people rushing to work, life continuing as if nothing had changed. But inside that cafe, for everyone who had heard him, everything had changed. They had seen how hate could be silenced not by louder hate, but by a deeper truth. They had seen how one man's calm could dismantle centuries of ignorance in just a few sentences. They had seen grace defeat cruelty, and they would not forget it. The story didn't end when the woman walked out. It didn't end when the applause faded. It didn't even end when Marcus finished his coffee. The story lived on in the hearts of everyone present, in the phones that had recorded it, in the whispers carried from that cafe into the wider world. The story became bigger than Marcus, bigger than the insult, bigger than the moment itself. It became a testament to something timeless, that hate may speak loudly, but truth speaks deeper, that cruelty may wound, but dignity heals, that a single voice, steady and unbroken, can leave a crowd speechless, not from shock, but from respect. And that is how the story ended, though in truth, it wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning.